late in the afternoon. Everybody on your feet. A little birdie told me that that might be a song that would appeal to you. Who could tell me who that was? What was the name of the song? All right. All right. So we are here today to talk about teams of heroic learners. And I'm going to set the stage around that in a couple of different ways. But I really want us to start. I noticed as I looked through the program today and who was talking and so on, this is a theme that's coming up more and more. It really is. And so we're going to explore this a bit. We want to be able to sort of celebrate the learning that we do in our work. So we're going to do some quick introductions. This is, if you've heard about any of these things, I'm partially responsible. But I want to know who's here. So just a raise of hands. How many here would consider yourselves builders? So programmers, testers, people who are actually putting the product together. Okay? How many of you are managers? Okay. Coaches, consultants? All right. How many of you think you might belong to more than one of those tribes? Yeah. So this is going to be about our roles in doing this. And what we're going to talk about first is just the idea of learning. What's going on when we are involved in learning? So Niels this morning talked a lot about Peter Drucker and his idea of knowledge work, which was quite transformative at the time when he brought it up, and is a thing that people still have not fully embraced. That there are people who need to do work with their heads more than heavy lifting with their hands, right? But what I've noticed lately, that having information, knowing stuff, is becoming less important than the ability to learn new stuff, because things change so often. There's somebody recently, you've heard the whole soft skills, hard skills debate, right? Somebody recently proposed that what we have been calling soft skills, we should actually call permanent skills, because they are helpful to us wherever we go, if we know how to communicate, how to give feedback, how to manage conflict, all those kinds of things. And those other skills, those things we used to call hard skills, this person proposed we should call those temporary skills. Permanent and temporary, because there's always more to learn on the technical side, right? We've had millennia to figure out the soft skills, the permanent skills part. The technology skills are coming at us faster than we can embrace them. So why should we bother with this? Why should we think about this? I think because knowledge work is learning work, and software development falls squarely in that knowledge work camp. No matter where you are involved in it, if you're a manager, a developer, a tester, whoever you are having to learn faster than you ever did before. And if we know how to learn effectively, that leads us to resilience and agility and helps our organizations stay alive. So how has that changed? How do we think about that differently? I was at the, it seems, you talked about this morning seemed like a long time ago. Monday, to me, seems like ages ago. But Monday morning of this week, Jeff Sussna was the keynote speaker at the Deliver Agile conference. And he said, you know, this is what we do every day. We are learning all the time. Right? He was talking about it in the context of DevOps and UX and cross-functional teams and so on, but it's true. I actually wrote down a lot of things from his talk, but I couldn't cram them all into this one. So, a few months ago, when was it? March 2016, I guess maybe a couple of years ago now, Melissa Daimler published an article in the Harvard Business Review. And she said, and if we take it out of the individual realm to the organizational realm, she says organizational learning has to become less about the kind of learning that we do in a classroom and more about the kind of learning that we do every day. Less about individual learning, more about learning that teams do together. And how to use the environment for one another. So a little while we're going to talk about how do you set up that environment for learning. Who's heard this term VUCA? Yeah, it's getting, you know, when I first started asking people this, it'd be like, what? But we're learning more and more about it. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, it came out of the U.S. Army War College. And after they'd been talking about it in the military for a while, some business folks took a look at it and said, well, seems like our work is happening in these kinds of environments too. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. The only way through those kinds of circumstances, the only way you get through those kinds of circumstances is by learning as fast as you can. Is Dan here? The empirical process, right? Let's try this, what happened? Let's try this, what happened? What can we learn from that? Now let's try this other thing. What happened there, right? I love this man. I just love this man. I am old enough that I was fortunate to be able to actually attend a workshop of his. He was older than I am now at that time, but learning isn't compulsory. And whenever you do learning, you learn anything new, you are on the change cycle. With the folks that study appreciative inquiry, one of their tenets they call the principle of simultaneity. As soon as you ask the question, you have begun the change, right? Humans learn in the direction that we ask questions. That's what causes us to learn. It's what are we curious about? What do we want to know? We learn in that direction. And so, as soon as we learn something, we can never go back to be that person who didn't know that, short of some sort of drastic accident, right? You can never go back. You are permanently changed with each new thing that you learn. So Jim Shore and I, a couple of years ago, wrote an article about the Agile Fluency model, and we just recently wrote an update to that. But it is based on the premise that every software team has in front of it a set of learning tasks. And if we really understand what are the proficiencies that this team needs to learn, we can be more effective in how we support our teams to get to where the organization needs them to be. So there are some folks here who have done some of the training with the Agile Fluency project. Would you raise your hands if you've done that? Yeah, so if you're interested in more about Agile Fluency, you could talk to them or talk to me. So fluency, the reason we talk about fluency when we're talking about learning is that fluency is the way developing fluency helps you understand what direction you want to ask your questions, right? Fluency is the things that we do automatically without thinking. How many in here are native Maine English speakers? Right? How many of you are Native American English speakers from someplace else in the country? Okay. How many of you grew up with another language and have learned English as a second language? How many of you have learned other second languages? Right? If you've had that experience, you know the idea of fluency. You know that fluency really does tag to what it is you need to do with it. So it has to do with, do I want to be a tourist? Do I want to go someplace and live? Do I want to become a university lecturer? Fluency looks very different in all those situations. I bet some of you who are not native Maine English speakers, when you come here and you're wandering around on the street, you may hear some things that make you go, am I fully fluent here? I don't know, right? Because fluency is the things we do without thinking, automatically, the way we just respond without even having to stop and think about it. And so it is routine. It is the skills that we have ease in. We don't have to think about them very much. And they persist. We don't fall back on old habits if we're truly fluent. We stay with the new fluency that we have. It has to do with both understanding the theory of the thing and having the opportunity to practice that thing. So deliberate practice becomes a big part of this. And what we need from our organizations is for them to support us in doing that deliberate practice so that we become more fluent, so that we can accomplish the things that we're all trying to accomplish together in our organizations. So that was the little 8-minute tour through learning. Now I'm going to look at 3 particular ideas about learning: courage, compassion, and confidence. These are all aspects of learning that we really need to pay attention to. Courage has to do with being willing to step up to learning, to make way for learning, to admit that we may have a need for learning. So we think about it as facing our learning challenges. Courage is not the absence of fear, right? Courage is feel the fear, do it anyway. Right? That's somebody, to quote somebody. So it's doing the hard stuff around learning. It's being willing not to know, to go into ambiguous situations when we're in that VUCA world and say, I don't know what's going on here, right? It has to do with being able to stand in inquiry, as one of my mentors says to me. Be willing to not know, but say, let's find out. Let's go learn this thing. We don't know enough about it. It's often messy. It is often inefficient, right? Sometimes we have to flail around a bit before we get to the learning part. You have to be willing to do that. To be wrong. We went in the wrong direction. Thank God we can inspect and adapt and adjust, right? Now we know more about where not to go. We can learn where to go. And the willingness to be seen to be wrong. Now we're going to practice this a couple of times. How many of you have ever been to an improv club or a sports comedy club or those kinds of things? Then you are familiar with something called the failure bow. When we are learning things, we're going to get it wrong more often than we get it right. And our immediate tendency when we get something wrong is to hunch our shoulders over and go, oh, I did it wrong. I messed up. Right? Which shuts down everything. It shuts down all of our systems, shuts down the learning. So the one new skill that I want you to walk away from today, the thing we're going to learn absolutely today before we're done here, is the failure bow that comes with the phrase, how fascinating. So I'm walking along and, I tripped over that thing. I probably look kind of silly doing that. So what am I going to do? How fascinating. There's a hole in the floor here. Examine it. How fascinating! Look at that thing. And I just walked right. How fascinating, right? I'm not going to do that again, right? So everybody up. 3 times. 1, 2, 3. See, once you do it then it'll seem easy after this, right? Okay. 1, 2, 3. How fascinating! How fascinating! How fascinating! Okay, sit back down. Right. If you can do that at work, you have enough courage to learn. Another aspect of courage has to do with being willing to challenge our assumptions. There are a lot of things in our work lives, in our world, where we have made assumptions about how things should go. And it often sounds something like, well, we tried that once before. It won't work here. Right? Context may have changed. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it really wouldn't work back then when we tried this before. But it might work now. New people, new environment, new all kinds of things, right? Thinking about our assumptions means that we have to be willing to unlearn before we learn. We may have to say, this has been my route to work for the last 5 years, and this morning I came to work and there was this big pothole. Now, I can keep driving to work and falling into the pothole and damage my car or maybe myself, or I can change my assumption about the right way to get to work and find a new route. Right? So when was the last time you unlearned something? The other thing about courage is being willing to make time for learning. And this is an area where I think a lot of companies miss the boat. Many organizations miss the boat. This whole idea of 100% utilization. I've heard here a number of times people ask questions about, well, what about if I'm on this project, but then I'm also doesn't take all my time. So am I also on this other project? And then there's this, right? Any project that we're not on 100% of the time is not getting our best effort. So how do we make time for learning? We might incorporate Slack. I know a number of companies that have not just done what Google did for a long time with the 20%, but they have a daily learning hour. Part of every day of work is to spend an hour learning something new. And some of those things have to do with sharing with teammates. Other things maybe just to get my own skills better in a certain area. I love this quote by Agile Maine. And what comes out of that is, what if speed to learning was your key metric? How can we get good at learning around here? And what if we measured that? What would we look at to know that our speed to learning was decreasing? How would you assess it? So the other thing about teams is that they need to share what they learn. So there needs to be time for that as well. There's some wonderful terminology that's coming up around co-intelligence in groups. I don't need to know everything that everybody on my team knows. I only need to know who on my team does know about the stuff I don't know about. And as long as all of us have it covered, we're good, right? If we want collective coding standards, if we want collective ownership of the code, we have to be able to learn together. We have to be able to transfer knowledge between team members and in the organization, to some extent, between teams. So we have to be able to say we value collective ownership over individual achievement. Because another great quote from Deming, only it's one of those ones that could have been said by 6 different people, gets attributed, is none of us is as smart as all of us, right? So that's courage. Let's talk about compassion for a minute. Why do you think compassion might come up? Anybody got a thought? Why would we talk about compassion when we're talking about learning? People learn at different speeds. We're all different. We all have different things we need to learn. It's really helpful if we have leaders who do what Chip Bell called lead out loud, be seen learning. Because learning takes time. It's not flipping a switch. Learning takes time. We may have had some experiences in school where we were supposed to be learning that weren't so pleasant. Anybody here have a public school experience that was supposed to be learningful, but what you learned was you never want to do that again? Yeah. So a lot of us get taught that learning isn't fun, just like we're taught that we can't sing and we can't dance and we can't draw and all those kinds of things. There's an idea out there that if you take time for learning, that's selfish, right? How could you do that? How could you spend time on that? We needed you over here. Well, the thing I was learning is going to speed up what we're going to do next, right? And we have fears. We have all kinds of fears about learning. We're afraid we're going to look foolish when we learn something new because we're not going to get it right exactly the first time. We fear that it's going to lead us to have to change our ideas about some other things. Right? We have all these fears about learning, and that's why we need to be compassionate with each other, because we're all dealing with some bundle of fears around certain kinds of learning. How many of you love to do like role plays in workshops? 2 hands go up, right? We learn through practice. It's the only way, right? So Robert Marshak wrote a great book called Covert Processes in Organizations. It was about his observations that there are the things that we talk about all the time in business, and he called those the things that are on the table. These are the permitted topics of discussion. He said, but what goes undiscussed are our hopes and dreams, and what kind of a future would I like to see for myself and my family and my workplace? We don't talk about that very much, so we don't learn that about each other, so we can't support each other in reaching those dreams. And then he said there's this other group of stuff that's under the table. Things like those fears of learning, worries and concerns about what's going to happen next. We often don't share those either, so we can't help to mitigate them for each other. So real learning happens when we come together compassionately and understand that all of these things are going on and that they're all sources of learning. For teams to become truly great teams, the team members need to know how to interact with each other. We have to develop our social relationships a bit. We don't have to become best friends, but we do need to be able to hang out together for a couple of hours without running for the door, right? That's what that level 1 to level 2 relationship with. If you've never read the book, Ed Schein is a wonderful writer about organizational life. And he's written a book called Humble Inquiry and Humble Consulting. And in those books, he talks about this idea of level 1 is sort of the transactional exchange kind of, I'll give you money, you'll give me product kind of relationship. But level 2 relationships are when we get to know each other. And he makes a point that in his study, when you are in level 2 relationships, you get more done. We've heard a lot about psychological safety. There's been a number of sessions here today about psychological safety, so I'm not going to spend a great amount of time here. But all of these things will help you create that environment of psychological safety, which will allow people to say the things they need to say, name the elephants in the room. Here's another thing. If you haven't already seen it, Google Elephant Safari Willem Larsen. My son Willem is on a programming team. He's a programmer, and they have developed this protocol that they use when they are thinking something's going on here and we're not talking about it. And they talk about going on an elephant safari. They track it down. And he's written up their process for doing that, so you can check that out. But before you can get good at anything, you have to give yourself permission to suck at it, right? When we learn, we go through that dip, and we don't know how to do this. If we just stop, then we're just back in the old way of doing it. We never learn the new way. We've got to practice, but we're probably going to be kind of sucky at it. So, how fascinating! All right, everybody up. How fascinating! How fascinating! It always comes in threes, by the way. It comes in multiples of 3. Yeah. Multiples of 3, always. So I also said that there is that we learn in the direction that we ask questions, and that the idea of standing in inquiry is really important. How often do you cultivate in your teams a sense of wonder? Wow, look at how fast that went. What's your pool of knowledge? In Lisa Atkins' book about coaching agile teams, she has a great little activity called Marketplace of Skills that she got from somebody else, and we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? But this is a way for a team to come together and notice, gosh, what have we got in our bucket here? I did this with a team one time, and they wrote up, what they wanted to learn and what they thought they knew well enough to teach, and a couple of other things that are part of this activity. And lo and behold, there was somebody who had just bought a new house, and it had a bunch of fruit trees on the property, and they had never dealt with fruit trees before. So they said, I really need to learn how to, do this. And then somebody else on theirs, where it said, here are the things I know so well I could teach, was how to care for yard work, how to do your yard work and prune your trees. They've been working together for 2 years. They had no idea about that, right? So that pool, and that team knowledge pool becomes really important. So you can level up the learning from everybody. Once you learn something, then your job is to make sure that somebody else on the team knows it as well as you do. That's the job. You don't get to keep it all to yourself. You have to share it, right? So, making space for people to learn. And people learn better when they're having fun. Just I mean, that's why we have a drive to play. It's because that's how we learn. If you've ever watched little guys, they are just little learning machines, and we call what they do play, right? If we did more of that, we would be better off. So when you learn something, pass it on. Always, always, always pass it on. So our next area here is confidence. Now we've got courage, we've got compassion. Now we need to build some confidence. Why would we need to build confidence? Any thoughts? Be confident learners. Why would that be helpful? So we're willing, absolutely. And so when we find ourselves in one of those VUCA situations, environments, we aren't paralyzed by it. We say, I know how to learn my way through this. I don't know what it's going to be right now, but I know how I can learn my way through it because I am a confident learner. There's a lot you gain when you really get your skills, your fluency about learning becomes high. Margaret Wheatley, anybody read any of her books? A lot of the leadership in the new science, and she was one of the first people to start to take what they were learning in the complexity and chaos theory researchers were learning and begin to apply it into organizational life. So one useful thing to figure out is what's your team's fluency target? What learning, what proficiencies does your team need to learn? So I'm going to bring this one back again here. This is a really good key, and there's an article, it's for free, it's on Martin Fowler's his Blicky, that tells all about this and what the various proficiencies are, and it's really helpful to go there and say, this, I think my team has this kind of fluency. Is it a good match for the kind of product we're building or the intent of our organization? That would be an interesting line of inquiry. And if it is, and we fall short in some areas, how can we get some help in bringing our fluency up in those areas? It's a way of being, rather than just sort of broad brush, trying to learn everything just in case you need to cover something. It's a way of filtering that down, of figuring out what is it we really do need to know. I also want to give you some tips about how do you create an environment for learning. And we call these the 5 rules. I'm going to go through these very fast. Alive, setting, fluency, obvious, flow. There. Is that good enough? You want to know a little more about that? Okay. So, keep it alive. What can we do to create more aliveness here? Right? What have I done so far? This is a big auditorium. Right. How fascinating. We get us to move our bodies, right? Humans come in this package here that has all kinds of interesting needs and so on. And if we aren't paying attention to those needs, like air and water, I need water, we cannot survive. But people also learn better when our senses are engaged. So are we being physical? Is there good fragrance? Are we getting plenty to eat? Do we have cool things to see and hear where we are learning? Another aspect of the human need to be alive is our relationships. So connecting, the way we connect with our team members and other people in our environment. Alive. Attend to the setting first. Whenever I go into any kind of a situation in an organization where I'm holding a meeting or anything where I think I would like to see some learning happen here, I immediately begin to look around and I say, how can I make it more alive here, and the other 4 rules. Paying attention to the setting right away is important. I like to do what we create collaboratories. Every team needs its own collaboratory, right? A space where it can learn together, build together, be alive together. How can we get closer to doing it for real? This is how you build fluency. So when they needed astronauts to learn to do spacewalks, taking them into space and shoving them out the door was not a great way to learn that, even though that was really doing it for real, right? So sometimes we can't actually be in the actual environment where we're going to enact some learning, but how can we get as close as possible? So you know what they did with the astronauts? They suited them up and they tossed them in a deep pool of water, right? That's as close to weightlessness. Or they take them up in one of those planes, but that doesn't last very long. That was kind of the problem with that one. And so then they figured out the swimming pool solution. To walk around in a spacesuit in a swimming pool, right? So how can we get closer to doing it for real? I'm engaged in a process right now of people wanting to learn some things, and we talk about the thing for a little bit, and then they go off and they go back to their organizations and they actually apply whatever it was we just talked about. And then we come back and we say, how'd that go? And they say, okay, well, let's adjust it this way. Go try it again. And they come back and we say, okay, now we're going to take that thing that you learned, and now we're going to layer this other thing on top of it, and now we're going to send you off it. So doing it for real, whenever you can. It's in the doing of the work that we discover the work we need to do. What are we learning about the nature of our work? Start obvious, stay obvious. How can we make learning more obvious? How can we be clear about what it is we need to learn and what path we're on and what the next thing in our journey is? I think one way of doing this is changing the way we do our meetings. Right? What if every time you had a meeting, the focus at the top, the purpose of the meeting was, we're getting together to learn this, right? I've thought a lot about, certainly from retrospectives, I think about people learning in their retrospectives all the time, but I began thinking about it, we talk about stand-up meetings as being a communication vehicle, right? We're going to pass some information between and among each other about what's going on. But what could we do to amp that up, right? To make it more alive, make it more doing it for real even more. So what if we ask these questions in our stand-up meeting? What did you learn this week? How'd you apply it? How did it relate to the work that we're doing? What did you learn that could benefit all of us? What have you learned that surprised you? Is there anything going on in our code base that we should all know about? What do you hope to learn next? What's in your way of learning whatever comes up next? Right? And then finally, the last of the 5 rules is focus on flow. And it has to do with how can I, for myself and for others and for our organization, better create the right size and sequence of the things we need to learn. And one way we talk about that is making sure it's bite-sized pieces, right? The metaphor there is you want it small enough that you can easily take it in and consume it and easily digest it before the next bite, right? What else does that make you think of? Does that bring to mind anything you're already doing in your teams? What about sizing stories? Are we sizing our stories in such a way that they are easily consumable by the team? The team can chew them up, digest them, and move on to the next one? Right? Bite-sized pieces. Okay. So that's confidence. If you can manage all of those things, you can become a confident learner. You will never be confronted by a situation that will paralyze you or will overwhelm you. You will just get busy learning your way through it. And if you've got teammates and you can learn your way through it together, so much the better. So, we're almost at the end. I want to leave a few minutes for questions. Get your teams, great teams give back. They have the courage to learn and they have courage to stand up for their learning and they give back what they learn. They pass it on. They share the learning that they gain between and among team members. Great teams take time to reflect, right? You do this with courage, compassion, and confidence, and your teams really do approach greatness. So on your team, give you a couple of minutes here. What's your plan for continuous learning? Continuous. Not every other Friday we have a retrospective and we try to learn a little something there. You know, when we first proposed that idea, people did feel like that was continuous. If you did something every 2 weeks, wow, right? Now, I have visited a number of mob programming teams, for instance, where they are holding multiple mini retrospectives every day and then a big 15-minute one at the end of the day, every day. Continuous learning. What's your plan for that? Here's something I learned from John Miller. He's been working a lot using Agile, Scrum in particular, in schools, and his Twitter handle is @AgileSchools. He does some really interesting things. But he proposed that we take the classic Connextra story template and we turn it into an agreement around learning. As a team, as the wiffle ball team, whatever your team is, we want to learn. What's a candidate for learning on one of your teams? What's something that's in front of one of your teams that you need to be focusing on learning very soon, if not right now? We have to learn how to deliver more often. So, you know, there's a piece of that that's about how often can our customers take delivery, or do we have an internal production environment? There's a lot of questions in that one. So that we can do something that helps us deliver greatness, right? Achieve greatness for our organization. So, thank you. Any questions? I know there is more cash bar out there, so I know that we're in between you and more cash bar. But I did end earlier than my time box, so we have... Any questions? Jenny. Use your outdoor. Stand up and use your outdoor voice.
Oh, I can do that.
Yeah. I know she can. That's
I've always asked about metrics for learning. Have you seen some that help people kind of point their feet in the right direction?
I have, actually, and I wish I could remember them right off the top of my head. I think, one of the things is some of those mob programming teams that I was talking about. I have seen them, they actually, one of them, is everybody here familiar with Hunter Industries, where they kind of started this whole thing around? They stood on the shoulders of giants, and they learned what worked best for them, and it turned out to be something they called mob programming. And they actually invited me in to do a 2-day team heroic learner workshop. And out of that, they have adopted a number of practices where, like the tiny, 3-question retrospectives at every break, every Pomodoro break, and then a bigger one at the end. And they actually do track, are our habits changing over time? Because they're getting those frequent reminders. So that's one way. Another way is to things like, to toot our own horn, things like the Agile Fluency diagnostic. Teams take the diagnostic, set themselves some, in X amount of time, we believe we can get better at this, and then check in on that later on. So there are some ways, how often can we hit our targets that way? So there are some things like that, yeah. Who else?
I've got a pretty loud voice myself. My question is about the speed in which a large organization can transform from a waterfall methodology to more of an agile mindset or agile methodology. Can you talk about how larger organizations can achieve that?
It's a big question. It is a big question. And it's interesting because you have to be in that place where you're really willing to not just learn but change and be changed, right? And sometimes the fastest that we see something like that happen for an organization is when there is a huge crisis, right? A natural disaster, you bet the community members change their mode of behavior. They start doing things differently. They come together to address whatever the disaster was. We see that happen every year, all the time, right? That's an organization. A community is a kind of organization. In business, it's a lot harder to get that much impetus. And what's interesting to me is that in some businesses, and there are case studies and all kinds of things that you can read about out there about like this, where they were so invested in continuing to do the things, Kodak, they were so invested in continuing to do the things the same as they had always done them, that they did not see the enormous boulder rolling downhill toward them that was digital, right? So, you have to have not only a need for the learning and the change, but a willingness. And I think Dan was talking about that in his talk. Neil's alluded to it. Many of the sessions today are talking about how do we help to foster that. My personal way of doing that is I look for the places that are already ready. I would rather get through 10 organizational changes where they were really ready to do it than struggle with one where they weren't ready and never really quite get there. Because I think the more organizations look around and see this working someplace, the more they are going to get ready. But we can't make them ready. It's bad news. How fascinating. It's all humans. How fascinating. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody, and for inviting me. And enjoy the bar. Oh, that's right, you have
Yeah.
some,
No, I was gonna say, can we end with that song?
oh, I have to go find it again.
Also, we have a raffle. If you want to stand, we need a couple of people just to draw. But we have a speaker for Ecuador and Echo Plus. Amazon's our next sponsor. So can I have somebody just draw and send it and help me out? All right. So, Christine Kennedy. All right. You get to choose which one you want. Really? Yeah. Okay? So that's from, is that? Info Scratch. So one of our sponsors. Thank you, Info Scratch. All right. And we have another one? Dennis or? Thank you.